Imagine this. You just bought your first camera and you throw the in-the-box lens on. You run out, ecstatic to finally take pictures on something other than your phone. You meet your friend on the street, take their portrait, and alas, the photo looks horrible. But you nailed exposure and focus was good. Sure, maybe your composition could be better, but you thought the blurry background would hide that. The thing is, your background is about as sharp as can be. You go home, find your nearest trash can, and toss that camera right in. Why use a nice camera when you can get better results with your phone's portrait mode? The truth is, there are so many different variables that affect the sharpness of your image's background. Let's start by describing some terms. To start, the overall term is depth of field. Basically, your image's depth of field is the amount of things that are able to be in focus at once. Imagine there being an imaginary box between the background and your lens. The box can move forward or backwards depending on where you place it, and everything inside that box is in focus and sharp. Now, this box can vary in thickness. When the box is extra thick, we call that a deep or wide depth of field. When the box is thin, we call that a shallow depth of field. And the box as a whole is called the focal plane. Now, everything outside of that box gets a special photography term too, which we call bokeh or bokeh, whatever way you want to pronounce it. There's really no right way. Bokeh is simply put the out of focus elements in frame. If the bokeh is in front of the subject, we call those foreground elements. If it's behind, we call those background elements. For obvious reasons, one's in the foreground and one is in the background. So now you know how blurriness is described, but how do you actually achieve it when you're shooting? The average photographer will simply just say your aperture, but that wouldn't be telling the full story. Sure, aperture does affect the amount of bokeh, particularly your f-stop will determine the thickness of that metaphorical box of your focal plane. At a lower f-stop or a wider aperture, your focal plane will be thinner. At a higher f-stop or a smaller aperture, your focal plane will be wider. Therefore, if you shoot at a more wide open aperture, you will have more bokeh in your image. And if you shoot at a more closed down aperture, you'll have less. Oftentimes, people discount kit lenses for this reason alone. They can't open up enough to allow for a shallow depth of field. But there are other ways to achieve a blurry and cinematic background in your images. I want to briefly mention sensor size. The larger the sensor, the more background blur your photos will have. Most phones have a sensor sized around 1/2 inch, which is tiny when compared to any professional or consumer camera. Most entry-level cameras have an APS-C sized sensor, which collects about 15 times more light than your phone. As you go up in price, full-frame cameras, equivalent to 35 millimeters, collect about 35 times more light than your phone. Because of this, you can expect similar results to translate to your image's background blurriness between sensor sizes. Okay. You already have your camera and you aren't serious enough to shell out, a few $1,000s on a nice full-frame camera. So what else can you do to increase your bokeh? Well, lens compression is an easy solution. Without going into detail about focal lengths, the higher focal length you shoot at, the more it compresses the distance between the foreground and the background. The objects at each extreme, in turn, grow in size, and this does include your bokeh. By shooting at a more telephoto focal length, you won't necessarily make your image have more bokeh, but you will make the bokeh more prominent. The bokeh gets bigger. Take a look at these 4 photos. I tried to frame them as similarly as possible. The first was shot at 12 millimeters on a full-frame camera, super wide angle. The second at 28, a pretty standard focal length. The third was at 85, which is known as the portrait master focal length, although there is no correct focal length for portraits. And lastly, 200 millimeters, quite telephoto. To keep things consistent, they were all shot at a wide open aperture of f2.8. So, the aperture is the same, but notice how the bokeh grew larger and more prominent as I went up in focal length. So if you want your kit lens to be a bokeh machine, zoom in to the greatest focal length that it has. Last but not least, somewhat coinciding with lens compression, distance to subject is the final variable to consider when trying to get a blurry background. The closer to your subject that you can be, the more towards the foreground your focal plane will dip. Because of this, there will be a lot more stuff behind the focal plane to be thrown out of focus and become bokeh. This is why more macro photography shots have such buttery, creamy bokeh. So, you may not have thousands of dollars worth of gear, but by opening up your aperture, zooming in, and closing the distance between you and your subject, you can get real professional portrait mode. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe so that you don't miss any more tutorials that I'll be putting out in the future. Leave a comment if you would like a specific tutorial to be made. And let me know what you guys thought. Let me know what I can do better. I'm always looking for improvements. Hit that like button, it helps me out a ton, just boost the YouTube algorithm, and I appreciate each and every single one of you guys watching. Thank you guys so much, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Peace.